Welcome to this edition of Excavating the Bible, What Archaeology Can Teach Us. This program is dedicated to exploring the contributions of Middle Eastern archaeology to our understanding of and appreciation for the Bible. I'm Doug Clark. I direct the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology at La Sierra University in Riverside, California, and I'm joined by two La Sierra colleagues, Dr. Larry Garrity, former president of La Sierra University, and Dr. Kent Bramlett, who is now an associate professor and doing archaeology in the history of antiquity and some languages, Hebrew as well. All of us, Old Testament, well, in love with the Old Testament and with archaeology.
And the two of you are just freshly back from Jordan.
Yeah. We have spent 2 months.
Couple months.
Doing our every other year excavations at the site of Tel El Ameri, which our viewers will have seen from earlier times. And we find ways to tuck it in to our discussions
as often as we can.
As often as we can. We have been working our way through the Bible, archaeology and the Bible, book by book, and are now in the 8th century BC. We've followed the biblical canonical order for most of this, but when we got into the prophets, we thought it might be good to do it by century, because then we create a context, a historical context, and then we can work with those prophets addressing those problems. And so we're not following the biblical order, we're following more of a chronological order. And we hope that's helpful in the process of going through here. And we turn our attention in this particular episode to the book of Micah. 8th century prophets and Micah. Initial reactions.
You know, it's a time when we have a lot of archaeological evidence that provides the context for what the biblical prophets are doing during their time. And traditionally, Micah and other contemporary prophets contain a lot of unknown words and difficult passages, but archaeology has helped us to understand it a lot better than we used to. And we have to realize that if you look at the time of Micah down to the time of the New Testament, when Micah was quoted, there are 600 or 700 years between those times. And so if you subtract our time going backwards, we go to the medieval period. We know so much more about the times of Micah now than they have even in New Testament times. We understand more of the passages, so we really have to be grateful for all the work that's been done archaeologically.
Probably since the end of the 19th century?
Yeah.
The 19th century, when we have archaeology really becoming more scientific and moving toward the 20th century, when we now we do there's so much that's scientific now, and we've talked about that. And even what we talk about this evening or today at this particular episode will have some science behind it. So much more. Kent, what about the 8th century prophets and Micah?
Well, I think of the sort of the political context. It's a very dicey time to be a small kingdom in the Eastern Mediterranean world. The 9th century, or the 800s, had been more stable. It was sort of a political lull from much of the century. But you get into the 8th century, or the 700s, and there are some real problems on the horizon. The Assyrians are resurgent, and they're gobbling up these small states as they progress west and south. So the prophets, we already looked at Amos, didn't we? And then we've got Micah, soon we'll have Isaiah.
Hosea,
Hosea, right. They are really struggling with this issue of security. And what does it mean to be God's people? The promises, faithfulness of the people, and we come back to this again and again in Micah.
As you say, you have these larger kingdoms, Assyria in the north and Babylon further to the east. And then on the west and the south, you have Egypt. And they're all passing through the land that we're interested in, Israel and Judah, aren't they?
They are.
Causing trouble.
Yes.
Well, control and causing trouble are probably, they probably always go together.
They do.
They certainly do for the 8th century. Before we look at the book itself, we have some artifacts in front of us. Kent, maybe begin over there. These are not all from the 8th century, but we're trying to pick artifacts that somehow tie to our discussions of Micah.
Well, I see a lot of themes here. Micah is concerned about justice, doing right, and I see these pillar figurines, which most interpret as some representation perhaps of a fertility goddess, Asherah figurine, something which might be not quite right with the prophets. Now, we find a lot of these around Jerusalem, right? So the interpretation of these is somewhat difficult. But that probably represents that issue in society. How do we worship God in the right way? Of course, weights. Micah talks about honest weights on the scale, cheating, honesty in the marketplace. We have an execration bowl here. This has a curse written on it. And usually those would be broken to fulfill, to make the words come into effect through a magic rite. And of course, we have a lot of oracles against the nations in Micah that we might think of in the context of prophetic words. And more text. We have the written documents, a seal impression here. This is when we first began to really find regularly seal impressions mentioning individuals. Individuals which we know from the Bible. Hezekiah, we'll show some of these pictures of the seals. Ahaz, his father.
And both of those inscriptions that you're just talking about actually could go back to this very time. I mean, they could be contemporary with Micah, couldn't they? Because we have these particular handles that have the stamped on them that go back to this time. And this one is a cuneiform tablet, which has been broken. But that's used in Babylonia and Assyria, that kind of writing. And so very much contemporary with the time of that we're talking about today.
Larry, I think you have some metal objects in front of you.
Yeah, these are swords, and we know that in our passages that come from Micah, we talk about turning swords into plowshares. So you would break these up and use them for agricultural, peaceful purposes. Both of these are smaller implements that also could be used for warfare or for more peaceful purposes. But these kinds of things are certainly talked about in our passage.
Now, this set has more to do with food preparation. The upper milling stone, Micah does talk about it. We'll see something more about it in Isaiah as well. Especially this illustration of grinding the face of the poor into the ground. It's an upper milling stone that's used for that. So that metaphor of oppressing the poor, you couldn't miss it, nor could you miss the next one. These are not human bones. They do come from a burial site where human bones were found. But these are to illustrate a passage, we'll look at it in the slides, from Micah 3, where the poor are thrown into a large cooking pot. These are small cooking pots, but they're thrown into a large cooking pot, and they are chopped up and eaten. And so these artifacts here illustrate this kind of oppression of the poor in ways that would surprise us. We don't think about this as an implement of oppression, but it becomes that in the prophet's hands. So we'll have some occasion to think about those, and we'll want to keep these in mind as we go through the slides too. Okay, so we'll begin like we always do with an outline. This is at least how some people outline the book. And just quickly, the three major points have to do with conflict. The prophet with people who are in Judah who are to be judged. The second one, the prophet against different kinds of leaders, priests and other prophets. So there's a lot of prophetic conflict. And then the last one here, between God and his people conflict, which results in chapter 6 and that famous Micah 6:8 passage about loving justice and loving mercy and doing justice and so on, as part of a controversy, of a lawsuit So we're going to see a prophet here in Micah who's very creative, literarily, and in his use of metaphors, as we've seen with grinding stones and
he
things
takes
like
those
that.
right out of the contemporary times, doesn't he? I mean, we have lawsuits during this time, and even the kind of language and the order of this lawsuit is replicated in other documents that we have from the period.
Right. Yeah. So, several archaeological issues. I'm just going to note a couple. These come up through all of the 8th century prophets. Some of them do. Mm-hmm. And so we'll not have occasion to refer to all of them. But the general history and text from the mid to late 8th century, the 700s, the societal structures, economic systems, we have to work at reconstructing the economic system because we didn't live there. We didn't live through this. But the book of Micah assumes a particular kind of structure which was oppressive to the lower classes. Although there isn't a lot of class. What? The poor, which is what? Maybe 85, 90% of the population, and then some merchants, and then royal. That's probably how we have it, something like that.
Sounds a little bit like our own times, doesn't it?
In some places.
In some places, right.
And so we've got those issues to deal with. Care for the poor, social justice, urban guidelines or stipulations as opposed to rural ones. Micah comes from Moresheth Gath. I've often called him a country bumpkin. He's really one of the poor. Isaiah, on the other hand, his contemporary, is one of the upper class. They're both saying the same thing about how we treat the poor. But this one, Micah, comes from the poor. The role of prophets, we have some information from texts about that outside the Bible as well as in. And then sorcery and witchcraft. Maybe tied in some ways to the execration bowl. Perhaps we've got something like that. So, an interesting illustration, and I just found it, and it seems to have all the prophets on there. And it looks rather bleak. It looks, I mean, the prophets, the end is near. That's kind of how we think about the prophets. Lamentations got on there, and I guess that's just because of its connections with Jeremiah. A text from Mari. So we're talking about the previous millennium. Larry, what does this say? It's a prophet. It's a particular kind of prophet. What does this text say?
Well, this goes back to a prophet who lived along the Euphrates River, as you say, in the 2nd millennium. So it's much earlier than the time that we're talking about. But it does show that we have these prophets throughout the period of the Old Testament. So it's not just the 8th century, but they start much earlier and continue right on down through the whole period. And here's a prophet speaking truth to power to Zimri-Lim, the king of this city that's on the Euphrates River.
So what does that read?
It says, I am Adu, your divine patron. Have I ever asked too much of you? Hear the cry of your people when they suffer injustice. Do what I ask and what I have written. Obey my word. Protect the land. Defend the state.
I mean, that could be Micah.
It could be. It definitely
It could be any of the prophets who, in the course of their lifetimes, often go straight to these centers of power, as you mentioned. So we have that kind of thing going on. Different kind of text. Kent. What? Somehow tied to the ordeal associated with punishment for witchcraft and sorcery. So we have several tablets from the almost contemporary.
Right, 7th century.
With Micah, yeah.
So tell us what this is, Ken.
Well, we have an obsession, really, in this time period in Assyria with omens, with interpretation of the signs. And the kings of Assyria would go to great lengths to avert bad lineups of the stars and of omens. And so the astrologers were very important in maintaining the well-being of the king as they saw it. Right. And so here's just a text that has a list of spells.
A description of it, yeah. Go ahead, read it for us.
Okay, spells directed against demons and witches. Sorcery to an ancient Mesopotamian would not have exactly the same definition as it does in the modern day, but would be along the lines of performing acts that went against the known will of the gods acts which reflected on oneself the kind of power and prestige only the gods could lay claim to.
It's kind of a hubris here, kind of an arrogance, claiming something that really only God, or in their world, the gods would control.
Right. Others would define it as someone who could sort of co-opt, right, the power, use that for their own purposes. So they're dangerous.
Yeah.
You got to watch out for them.
Right. Okay, another part to this, tales of evil sorcerers and sorceresses are found throughout many periods in Mesopotamian history. And the writers of these tales always have them meet a bad end, as it seems they also did when submitted to the ordeal. These ordeals that we read about, even in early American history for witchcraft, they have a long, I mean, we're talking about a long, long history here. And at least in the time of Micah, this had somehow blossomed, and Micah felt the need to cite it as a particular problem and one that needed to be handled, matching at least what other people in the ancient Near East felt about sorcerers.
And it's interesting that this comes from the library of Ashurbanipal, who's an Assyrian king, whose capital is at Nineveh, which is now in ISIS control. We call it Mosul. So directly contemporary with the issues going on back and forth between Assyria and Micah in Israel, Judah.
Some artifacts, cooking pots. We've seen some of those on the table.
Right here in front of you.
We do, and we've also seen some swords. We don't have the agricultural implements so much that these were turned into. I don't think we have any in the collection, do we?
I don't think we do. They get used, so they get dinged up and worn out. The weapons were placed in tombs. It seemed to be more of an appropriate burial gift.
It would be nice for somebody to have been buried with their plow, but that doesn't seem to be part of the practice.
Not quite as prestigious.
No. So, and we've got some threshing. These agricultural metaphors are, again, typically used for how people are treating those beneath them. And it makes sense. You're treating the ground, well, you're treating people like you treat the ground. And so the prophet comes unglued about that. And the weights and scales and some bio-artifacts as well. Okay, Larry, read this for us. This is the passage that jumps out from Micah. Well, besides chapter 6, verse 8, he has shown you, oh man, what is good, and so on. This one is at the beginning of the book.
Hear, you heads of Jacob and rulers of the house of Israel, is it not for you to know justice? You who hate the good and love the evil, who tear the skin from off my people and their flesh from off their bones, who eat the flesh of my people and flay their skin from off them and break their bones in pieces and chop them up like meat in a kettle, like flesh in a cauldron.
Prophets didn't mind being direct.
They didn't. Yeah.
Didn't mince words.
Not to pun that, of course. But this is actually even more than these images of flesh and flaying and crunching and beating and cutting. They're actually out of order. It seems to me, at least some have pointed out, that the prophet is so agitated about this, he just doesn't even get the whole process in order. People are eating before they've put the bones in the pot to cook them. And so there's this high level of agitation. And he's treating injustice, social injustice toward the poor with extremely strong language in the process. Kent?
Well, that's what was left over. That's a cooking pot. And looking at the rim, I would say, yeah, that's about our time period. It's about Micah's time period. Looks about right. But those are chicken bones in the pots. And we do find, well, chickens not much earlier than this.
It's not much.
They're introduced from, of course, Southeast Asia, where they're native, endemic. And then they spread across the empires to the west. But chickens do become very important, but we find a lot of sheep and goats in earlier times.
So, at least bones in a cooking pot. And I don't think you can get this image out of your head. Once that has been put there by the prophet, it's really hard the next time you make a meal to miss the point and to forget how graphic is our treatment of the poor. And then another one, and I'm going to have to get close to this one and say something about it. This one is from a later time period. Here's the floor, and then the floor continues over here, and then this opens up into a large, and you can see by the half-meter stick here. So a full meter would be over here, but this is a large cooking pot, and probably more used as an oven at the time. But
so what archaeologists have done is just as though they took a hatchet and just cut that right down, and so you're looking at a section, aren't you?
Right, right. Which gives a great view of it, so we have a good idea of what it's like. Threshing materials.
You know, it reminds me of a threshing floor that we rented one time from a village, Palestinian village, just to the east of Jerusalem. And the village elders said, yes, you can excavate here as long as you put everything back, because when it comes time, harvest time, we want to use it again. But here's where those sledges that you see in the front are ridden by little boys, maybe, tied to an animal, and they go around and round and thresh the grain. And then they use those forks, and they throw the grain up, the threshed grain up into the air, and the wind comes along and creates two piles. The light, the part that is the chaff is very much lighter, and so it goes farther and creates its own pile, and the good grain is heavier and falls down. So they have two piles, and they pick it up and use the chaff maybe for stuffing pillows or something like that. And the good grain, of course, is ground, and that's what they use to get through the winter.
Another illustration of how people are treated.
Right, right.
As being threshed into the threshing floor. Well, Micah was poor. He knew all about these operations, and he knew that everybody in his audience was aware of this too. Even
rich and poor.
Rich and poor would know. Although inter-urban or inner-urban Jerusalem, those people might not know as much, but pretty much everybody else would know what this is about. And some scales. Kent, you talked about some scales and weights.
Yes, false weights have always been a problem. And who has the standard, to measure weights by? So merchants, they could shave off a little bit of the weight, and they'd have a lighter weight, and they could sell a certain amount of grain or produce as a given weight and charge that price, but actually there's less of it there.
We're reminded of that every time we get gasoline, because on the gas pump is the authority that has the weights and measures.
And they come through unannounced to check.
To check, right.
Just one illustration. Archaeologists are forever finding, if they do to the soil this flotation treatment that will allow these carbonized seeds to float to the top, then we come up with all kinds of seeds. So this is part of the scientific enterprise that we do. We can reconstruct pretty much the entire ecosystem of antiquity, from the 8th century, from the 7th century, from any century, because of what we find in these remains. So that's important. Some inscriptions. We'll not look at all of these because they are so much a part of our 8th century discussion. We've actually seen some of them already.
But there are three names, aren't they, of Assyrian kings, right. Shalmaneser, Sargon, Sennacherib, all mentioned in the Bible, all having produced lots of texts that we have excavated through the years and that illustrate this period.
Tiglath-Pileser we could put in there too for the first half of the century.
Called Pul in the Bible, right?
Pul,
P-U-L.
exactly. Lawsuits, we think we might have some texts like that. We have one in Micah 6. God is bringing a lawsuit, the Riv, against his people. So the mountains have been there. They're the jury, actually. They've watched all along as Israel has done what it's doing. They're the witnesses. And so this lawsuit is brought against them. What should I bring if I'm going to get out of this lawsuit? Well, those things won't help. The sacrifices won't help. What you need to do is return to justice and mercy and humility. That text, which is so important to so many, comes in a context which I think enhances its meaning and significance. So, okay, and then the Balaam inscriptions. Larry.
Obviously, Balaam existed long before this because it was the time of the Exodus. And remember when the children of Israel were coming into the land, Balaam was hired to curse them, but he just couldn't do it. He blessed them instead, and we have that whole story. So why would be talked about here? It's interesting that Micah, 7th and 8th century, refers to Balaam. And as fortune would have it, what you have pictured there is a text that mentions Balaam from this time. It's roughly contemporary, and it's from Jordan. There are a couple of trays with more of the inscriptions that can be seen in the museum. That's right, in Amman. So Balaam was important enough to be remembered long past the period of the Exodus, down into this period, and how he was involved with the people is referred to by Micah.
Right, right. And so you have Micah talking about Balak and Balaam, the story from Numbers. And in the process, you cannot escape the curse side of this. Don't expect that. And so, yeah, we have that illustration. And then we also have 3 Judean kings. One of them, Kent, this comes not contemporary, is that right?
It's later. They apparently moved the bones of the earlier king Uzziah in actually 1st century AD, so this is quite late. And they marked the new resting place of the bones with this inscription.
So, not to be opened.
Yep. Hither were brought the bones of Uzziah, king of Judah, not to be opened.
Okay, well, I don't know if any archaeologists did, so I'm not sure what.
Somebody did, because we have the cover to the grave.
That's true. And we do have Ahaz mentioned not only in other non-Israelite inscriptions, but even in this seal impression. And then Hezekiah, who is probably represented the best, the stamps. We'll look at those. This is a wall in Jerusalem. A sundial, not contemporary, but probably like what Hezekiah used. And then these pictures of the stamped jar handle. I think you referred to these, Kent, earlier when we were showing.
Yeah.
And they're called?
Lemelech,
So,
meaning to or for the king, belonging to the king.
Right.
So these were goods which were probably taxed and stored.
And then this recently found inscription, seal inscription, with the name Hezekiah on it. So we have illustrations.
And in Mary, where we've all been digging, we have found one just like that from the next century on.
Right, right. So they are fun to find. We won't have time to look at all of these, but we do have some archaeological work. Moresheth Gath is where Micah came from. Mareshah is not far, and it's a wonderful site to visit.
It is.
For what it shows. Akzib, some people are wondering if that's up on the northern coast or if that is also in the area. What would you say, probably close by?
It's probably the little village nearby, but later on the coastal town was more famous.
So it would fit the geography and the topography of where Mike is from. Thank you, Larry and Kent, and all of you for listening in to this episode of Excavating the Bible. We hope we provided something for you to think about and to advance you on your journey of faith, and we look forward to next time. Until then, think ancient, keep believing, and keep exploring. For Excavating the Bible, I'm Doug Clark.